I'd like to welcome you to the next instalment of our HR Expert webinar. Today I'm pleased to welcome Andy Farrell. Just a little bit about Andy to start. He's the founder of Management and Safety Training Limited, and today he'll explore the practicalities of the investigation process. This is to help HR professionals to analyse complex evidence and handle serious workplace allegations. Previous to working the health and safety field, Andy was a specialist investigator with 2 elite UK law enforcement agencies and worked on some really interesting cases from international fraud to drug and gold smuggling, where he'd be interviewing both witnesses and also the suspects. Andy also has published a book called Investigative Interviewing, which has a lot of useful information. It's well worth tracking that down and having a read of that. Okay, and if you would like to ask us a question, you can get in touch with us. You can email marketing@naturalhr.com and we will forward that question over to Andy, or you can email him directly at info@managementandsafety.co.uk and he'll get back to you with the answer to your question. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Andy now, who's going to continue with the webinar.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody. My apologies for the slight technical problems earlier, which is why we're doing this as a recording, not as a live broadcast. You now understand why I hate computers, and that's me. And the title of the broadcast, Investigative Interviewing, How to Conduct for HR Investigations. As Chris said, I have a background in law enforcement in investigations, which involved interviewing witnesses and suspects. So what we're trying to do basically is to bring those specialist skills forward into the commercial world, if you like, especially into HR, where you may be required at times to conduct sensitive interviews with people who may not be very cooperative. So what we're going to look at is the difference between management and investigative interviews, some psychology, some practicalities, and how to analyze the data which we're going to generate, which is what it says on this slide. So we'll understand the difference between management and investigative interviews, and they are very different. We'll look at some of the psychology principles behind investigative interviewing. We'll look at some of the practicalities involved in conducting an interview that are practical things to think about. We'll look at how to take statements properly, and we'll look at some of the techniques which you can use to analyze the data, because there's no point having the interview if you don't record it via a statement and then actually do something about it. I should point out, as Chris mentioned, this presentation is based on a book I've recently written, Investigative Interviewing, and there'll be details later of how to get a copy. And we're also actually developing a personal development course on this topic, and again I'll give you details of that later on. So there's the objectives. That's what we're going to look at now. So let's just move on. Now, of course, were this live, I would ask a question and wait for answers, but we can't do that, so I'll give the answer anyway. So the question is, the aim of the investigation is to find the culprit. Is that true or is it false? I think a lot of investigators, a lot of managers think that is the basic idea. They are investigating to find out who committed the offence, who transgressed. Actually, that's not the aim of the investigation. The aim of the investigation is to establish the facts, the hard data. Allocation of blame is for others to decide at a later stage. Okay, in real life, the manager may then decide who's to blame, may form an opinion, may deal with them later. But while in investigative mode, then the manager has to think about the facts and the facts only. He's not there to try and find who to blame. It's a very subtle distinction in some ways, but it's very, very important. If you start looking for somebody to blame, it's going to skew the way you look at things. So, I said at the beginning that the investigative interview is different to an ordinary management interview. So the question is, why? Well, if you think about an ordinary conventional interview, the manager is going to be in charge of what's happening. The manager sets the scene. He sets the venue, the time, the content of the interview, the purpose. He runs, or she runs, the show. The person being interviewed obviously is involved and has an input and should be listened to, but essentially the manager is in the driving seat, and that's fine. However, an investigative interview is totally different, because there the manager is looking at a situation which may result in somebody facing severe disciplinary proceedings. Somebody may get fired. It could destroy somebody's career. It could potentially end up with somebody being in court, be that civil or criminal. So there's a lot going on, a lot riding on it. So the people he's talking to may or may not have something to hide. And if they've got something to hide, they'll want to know what he knows so they can try and work around him. So it becomes, expression I used once, it's verbal chess with a poker face when you're interviewing like this. You're planning ahead, but you don't give the game away. What the person you're interviewing is looking at is, how do you ask the questions? What are you saying? More importantly, maybe, what are you not saying? And how are you responding to the answers? A dead giveaway, a basic mistake, is to say in an interview, "Oh, I didn't know that. Tell me more." You've just shown your hand. You've shown us an area there you have no knowledge of. You don't want to do that. They'll want to see how you respond. They may want to build their own responses. So you've got to be on the lookout for that. And they're also going to look at the manager's demeanor and their body language. Are they relaxed? Are they professional? Are they tense? Do they suddenly tense up when a subject is mentioned? All these factors come into play. The manager is under scrutiny just as much as the person they're talking to. And you have to be aware of that at all times. So there's the basic difference. Now, let's look in more detail at how an interview actually works. And let's look at body language. And before I go on to that in any detail, let's just ask another question maybe. It's often claimed a person will not look you in the eye if they're lying. So is that true, or is it false? Is it urban myth, or is it a valid statement? In actual fact, it's false. Because studies in the USA have been carried out by various universities. One university came up with a study analysing video interviews of people being interviewed in court proceedings. And it turned out that in many cases, the person was lying and looking the interviewer straight in the eye. So they will look you in the eye. Another university did the same a similar study, and discovered that most people don't look you in the eye. So there's no clear-cut decision on that. It's a case of, well, essentially everybody's different. You pays your money, you takes your chance. Other things to think about with body language. It's a very powerful subject, but it's one that can lead you astray very, very quickly. For example, people argue if somebody's lying, they're going to lick their lips. That's an indicator, telltale, they're lying. Well, yes and no. Licking your lips can be an indicator of stress. But being under stress is not the same as lying. They may be under stress purely because they're being interviewed and they're worried. So it doesn't make anybody stressed out. Of course, licking their lips could also be due to thirst. You don't actually know. So you've got to take body language very carefully. What you need to do, and this is not a course on body language, so we mentioned it in passing, but with the caveat, it is quite a complicated subject and needs special study. But ideally, what you're looking to do is to look for clusters of change, as they say, clusters of variations. So how are you going to do that? Well, What you do is when the interview starts, you settle the person down. You explain what the interview is about and so on. While you're doing that, you're noting how they're behaving. Do they look nervous? Are they fidgety? Are they looking around all the time? Do they look totally relaxed? What is their demeanor? So that is going to give you a baseline. Now, as you ask questions, you're mentally referring back to that baseline. And you're looking for changes, but not just one, you're looking for a cluster of changes. Take the licking lips again. They suddenly start to lick their lips when you ask them a certain question. Does that mean that they're under stress with that question? Maybe, or maybe they're simply thirsty. You don't know. You want clusters, such as they've suddenly started to lick their lips, and now they're not looking you in the eye, and they're fidgeting. And these are all variations on what they were doing before. That is a cluster. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are lying, but what it does suggest is that that question is making them feel uncomfortable for some as yet unknown reason. So what you then have to do is to decide how to probe that question. And we'll look a bit later on how you actually ask questions. There's a skill to doing it. So you make a mental note or maybe a physical note that that question has caused them a problem. And then you come back to that later. It may open up a completely new line of inquiry. Body language is interesting. I like watching these programs behind the scenes with the police and other fly on the wall documentaries. I like watching the interviews. And what I've noticed, and again, this is purely a personal observation, I've got no theoretical proof of this, but you often notice that when a prisoner is being interviewed, somebody who will end up being charged with the offence, they come in from the cells and they wrap themselves in a blanket. Now, is that because they're cold? No, probably not, because everybody else is in shirt sleeves, but they are wrapped in a blanket. So it may be that they're cold. I think it's more a case of protection. It's a safety blanket. They're trying to shut the world out, so they wrap themselves up in the blanket. And that's just an indication of how powerful body language can be, and the indicators that people can give without actually realizing it when you're interviewing them. It's what makes interviewing fun, is watching how people actually behave and trying to work out what they're up to. So body language is one way forward, but we've got to remember that witnesses are only human, as are interviewers, which also has to be remembered. So humans are strange creatures. They're not as good at remembering things, for example, as they might like to think. This idea that people have got photographic memories, not normally, no. And there have been a number of experiments conducted over the years into how people behave in situations, how they recall things, how easily they can be diverted, how that recall can be altered, and so on. And all of these are touched upon in the book. I'll just mention it here. A famous experiment was the gorilla experiment, which I think was run in about the 1970s. And you can get the video on the great god Google. What happened was that a university was running this research, and they got witnesses, or sorry, candidates, to look at a video of a number of students who were playing with a volleyball. So I think it was 5 students were wearing white shirts and 5 were wearing black, and they were throwing a volleyball between them at high speed. The subjects were told the purpose of the experiment was to check, count how many times a white player, a white shirt, threw the ball to a black shirt. So they had to keep score, and it was moving very, very quickly, required a lot of concentration. So they ran this experiment for a couple of minutes, people throwing the ball around, and so on and so forth. Then they stopped the video. Thank you very much. The first question they asked was not, how many throws did you witness? The first question was, how many people saw the gorilla? Which sounds a bit strange. And half the students sort of looked in amazement, what are you talking about? And then they ran the video back. And it turned out that midway through the session, somebody appeared wearing a gorilla suit. They strolled into the middle of the camera shot, right in front of the group. They stood there looking around. They waved their arms. They waved at the camera. They were there, I think it was something like 17 seconds. And then they strolled off again. Now, you'd think any eyewitness would remember seeing a gorilla. In actual fact, about half the students didn't. Why? Because they were focused on something else. They were focused on the task in hand. So they got effectively tunnel vision. They only saw part of what was happening. So people can be funny. Witnesses can also be subject to what's called heuristics, which are essentially mental shortcuts. We get bombarded with information all the time, day in and day out. We can't possibly deal with everything. So we develop these shortcuts, which tend to work most of the time. We know if we hear a certain noise, it is probably this, and we do that. We don't have to think about it or plan it, we just do it automatically. They're very useful, these heuristics, as they call them, but they can cause problems. And two examples are making assumptions and stereotyping. Making assumptions, we think we know what's going on. We simply assume, based on previous experience or whatever, oh, that'll be because of A, B, or C. Most of the time, you're right, but sometimes you're wrong. And in investigation, that can be crucial. Is the person telling you what they really saw or what they assumed that they saw? It's very difficult. You've got to think about assumptions. It can affect the way people view things. Stereotyping is the same. You may give it as an example, somebody who's driving an expensive car, very well dressed, very well spoken, has a large house, always got a few quid in his wallet. You think this person is wealthy. They know what they're doing. They are a successful businessman. And they may be. It could also be they're actually a fraud who's living off other people's money. They're a con man. But stereotype is what they're going to work on. They're going to give the impression that they are a very powerful person and therefore trustworthy, and you're going to fall for it. You have to be analytical. You have to think about the way you are analyzing the evidence. Are you making assumptions about things? Are your witnesses making assumptions? Have you actually got the hard data to prove what you're suggesting? And that takes onto the need to be analytical. In investigations, we have what's called the ABC protocol. And it stands simply for assume nothing at face value, believe nothing without checking it first, and then you check everything. Just don't take it for granted. Now, it sounds a bit paranoid. It's not. The thing is, you have to build your investigation on hard fact. So you constantly check. Am I making assumptions? How do I know? How can I prove it? If you don't do that, then you could build a case against somebody, maybe a complaint, or decide they have transgressed in some way, and it ends up going to court, a tribunal, and then a lawyer who's trained to analyze evidence will quite happily take it all to pieces, and you look embarrassed. Your interview, your building the facts has got to be on strong foundations. You've got to work on the basis all the time that whatever I'm saying now may end up being scrutinized by some hostile person at some later date. You've got to constantly go back, check, and check again. It's time consuming, but if you do end up in a witness box, and I speak from experience, it's nice to know that what you're saying is correct and you can prove it. So let's think about the interview itself. Okay, I said there's practicalities to take care of. You've got to think about the location. So you don't want an interview where there's a lot of unnecessary distractions. So don't interview them in a canteen. Take them into a private office. Possibly one without windows, so they can't look out the window and be distracted. You need to have a desk to take notes, but where are you going to put that desk? Do you want it between the two of you? Or do you want it to one side where you can simply casually lean on it to write your odd note? If you put it between the two of you, that acts as a barrier, but of course it reinforces the severity, the importance of what you're doing. If it's to one side, it makes it a little more relaxed and more of a chat rather than an interview, and that might work in your favor. And sometimes if it's a sensitive interview, then, and the police do this, they have interview rooms for sexual assault victims and so on, and children, where it's armchairs and coffee tables. It doesn't look at all like an office. It settles the people down and relaxes them. So think about the location itself. One caveat, very important, never ever do a group interview because, as I explained in the book, people can inadvertently influence other people's views. You need to get the person on their own and get their view, not a group view. Think about the interviewee, their suitability for interview, any problems. Example, if English is not their first language, they may be quite happy with ordinary conversational English, but if they're under stress, does their English falter a little bit? Do you really need an interpreter? And if so, where are you going to get one from? What's their age? What's their mental state? You know, somebody may not be that sharp, may not understand the subtleties of what's going on. So in their interest and in your interest to run a fair investigation, will they need a responsible adult present, somebody who can take their corner, if you like, and ensure that they're not inadvertently put in a difficult situation? Because you may, without realizing, ask a question in a complicated way. They're too embarrassed to say, I don't understand, but the responsible adult will pick it up and go, no, can you ask John that question slightly differently? Or did you mean to ask John this? It's got to be fair play all round. Think about how they're likely to react to that interview. Are they going to be hostile and aggressive? Which may, of course, be real, or it may be faked. Or are they going to be cooperative? How are you going to deal with it? If the person is hostile, what are you going to do? What's your reaction going to be? If they're apathetic, what are you going to do? I mean, sometimes people go, oh, no comment, no comment, I'm not going to play. Well, how are you going to deal with that? There are techniques. Even if somebody does go, no comment, I'm not saying anything, then fine, you just carry asking questions. It's not the end of the road. You've got to plan and prepare, and I can't stress that too much. It's fatal to go into the interview and think that you can somehow just wing it, because you won't get very far doing that. You know, if you get any success, it'll be a fluke. That's not the way to do things. One final thing to think about in the planning stage is think about what questions you're going to ask and in what order you're going to ask them, because there can be a tactical advantage asking questions in different ways, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Think about the question you're going to ask. Think about whether you need to introduce any documentation, any other evidence at some point. It depends how the interview goes, but if a person says categorically, oh no, I came in the building at 3 o'clock, if you got CCTV images which show at 3 o'clock they're nowhere to be seen, it may be advantageous at some point to put that to them and see what they say. Don't do it straight away, see what the story is, but it might be handy later on to put the pressure on them. So think about how you're going to do things before you actually start. We mentioned asking the questions. There are a lot of different types of questions. The obvious one is the open question, so called because you cannot answer it with a straight yes, no. You've got to give more information. And that is the investigator's lifeblood. They want information from the person they're talking to. The opposite, of course, is a closed question. And a closed question is one that can be answered yes or no. Like, is it raining? That's a closed question. The closed questions are useful because they can set the scene. So a closed question can work things like, are you the foreman in charge of this department? Were you in the factory at 4 o'clock? Are you responsible for this vehicle? These are issues which are not being disputed. So you do a closed question to get them out of the way quickly to set the scene, and then you move on to the meat of the interview. There are other kinds of questions, and we discuss those in greater detail in the book, but that's a starting point. Open questions, where possible, are the ones that you want to use. We said at the beginning that you put the person at their ease. So you tell them what the interview is about so they understand what's happening. That helps you then to get the baseline for the body language analysis. And then you let them tell the story in their own way without challenging. Just let them talk. As I say, the more they talk, the more gold they're giving you. And if they are lying, we'll let them carry on and see how far they go with it. It's only when they've actually finished their story that if you've got problems with it, then you challenge it and you want clarification. If necessary, they still can't explain themselves, then you start to challenge. And you see how they react. And the odds are they're going to try and lie. If they are lying and you challenge it, they're probably going to lie even further. And the more they lie, the deeper the hole they're going to dig for themselves. You've got to remember that when a person is lying, they're normally not that skillful about it. And they tend to think sort of one question ahead. They haven't really planned it out in their mind. So it's not in detail. To carry on lying does require a lot of mental gymnastics. They've got to remember what really happened, the version they gave you, the lies they told. They've got to think of something that will match those lies and be consistent, while all the time talking to you happily and trying to work out where you're going. There's a lot going on, and people can make mistakes very easily. And your job as an investigator is to uncover those mistakes. So you can gently help them along. And ways of doing that, I won't call them tricks, but they're techniques. Things like asking a question out of chronological order. Now, that could be quite powerful. You've asked them a question about something, they have lied to cover it up, and you've moved on. So there's a certain relief in their mind. That's been dealt with, file it away, on to the next problem. And then at the end of the interview, it's, what I think on. You said, can I just go through that again, please? What did you mean by that? And they've now got to run the tape back, as it were, remember what they said, why they said it, what was said later, and they've got to come up with a new explanation which all hangs together. And that can be extremely difficult. And you can see them starting to flounder. You can also introduce evidence. I mentioned maybe having a photograph of somebody photograph of somebody not coming into a building. If they are adamant they came in the building through the front door at 3 o'clock and then you show them the CCTV video and they're not to be seen, what are they going to do? Are they going to try and lie their way out of it? Oh, no, I meant it was on Tuesday. No, I came in the back door. Can they think that fast, or will they give up? I've actually had somebody without giving any details, who has been investigated regarding drug smuggling. And he was adamant it was not him. He had no interest. He had no idea what was going on. He was out in a little fishing boat with a couple of mates, and all of a sudden they got arrested. No idea why, Gov. No idea. And he carried on for quite some time until we introduced more evidence. And I basically explained to him, I know what you were doing, because did you realize, well, you won't have done, but for a week, you've been under surveillance from a close surveillance team. We know exactly where you went to and who you spoke to and what you were talking about and who you've rung. And at which point he just stopped dead. He was trying again to deny it. No, it was. And he stopped. And he looked at myself and the detective sergeant who was with me and went, Oh, all right, I give up. And he surrendered and gave the whole job up. So it can happen sometimes. Nice when it does happen. But that was all a matter of planning. We knew when to throw the evidence in. We'd let him dig a deep enough hole, and then we'd drop something on top of him and see what happens. Sounds cruel, but it's not. It's part of the job. I'm talking about sounding cruel. Think about overall approach. Remember, the interview is on by consent. They're there because they've agreed to be there, and they can withdraw that consent if they want to. You can't stop them. They're under arrest. If you give them reason to feel, rightly or wrongly, that they're being abused in some way or made fun of or being made a scapegoat, then they will walk out of the interview. And if they are being boxed into a corner and you've almost got them, if you then start getting, shall we say, a bit jubilant about it, I've got you, I've got you, I've got you, they're going to go, I'm not standing for that. You can't speak to me like that. And they'll, with a sigh, walk out the room. And all you can do is watch them go and wipe the egg off your face. You've got to remain professional at all times. No matter how they react, remain professional. Don't give them an excuse. One technique which I found very useful, I've used it in practice, is to blame myself. Oh, maybe it's me, but, as an example, maybe it's me, but I thought you said A and now you're saying B. I'm missing something, obviously. It's down to me. I've missed the point completely. Can you take me through that again? And let them try and recite the whole fairy tale and see if they can do it without tripping up. Quite often, they can't. It's good fun interviewing. Another question. You've got a disciplinary interview. Are you allowed to lie to somebody in order to get an admission of guilt? Well, the answer is no. If you do that, you leave yourself open to questions about your integrity. Imagine that goes to tribunal and it comes out in tribunal. You deliberately lied to the witness or to the accused. Their counsel is going to jump straight on top of you. If you lied about that, what else did you lie about? And they challenge your integrity and you can't really get out of it. You'll see if you watch some of these American TV programs that the police officer will deliberately lie to the witness. Under US law, Supreme Court have ruled you can do that. But that's in the States. I wouldn't try it in the UK. Never lie. You can make suggestions like, well, your colleague is being interviewed. What happens if he says this? So you're dropping the hint, but you're not saying that's what he said. There's a lot of notes. You have to take notes during the interview, obviously, because otherwise, how do you know what's going on? And there are many ways of doing it, and we look at that in more detail in the book. But one quick thing to look at is mind mapping. This is a technique. You can actually get a computer program. It's free if you want it. But essentially, rather than writing down what they said, you're writing down the key notes, the key phrases, and so on, which you then sketch and you link these together so you can see how the pattern is developing. It's a technique. It's very powerful. You can also use it for analyzing data as well. But note taking, there's a lot of techniques involved in doing it. You've got to be judicious in taking them. If you keep stopping the interview, keep writing more notes, it slows down the whole process and can just disjoint the whole conversation. Taking statements. Okay, so we've had the interview, we planned it, we've interviewed them, we've got to the heart of the matter, we think we've got the story out of them, we've made notes, we did it. So the next thing to do is to take statements. Why? Because you need a record of what happened and you want their story written down. It's no good saying, oh, he told me that in the interview. You want confirmation. You want the proof. You can prove that's his view of things because he's written and signed a statement for it. Without the statement, this formal signed record, then you're really back in the lands of conjecture. Now, when it comes to taking statements, a question arises. Can somebody include in their statement the details of a conversation which they've been told about, and which they may well believe, but which they haven't actually witnessed? Seems reasonable. The answer is no. That's classed as hearsay, and as such, it's inadmissible. The problem is that the accused person, if that is used against them, how can they verify that conversation? Because the person who talks about it wasn't actually there. So how do you know you've got the true story? It's not fair on them. So it's inadmissible. It doesn't go in the statement. The real question, or big question about statements, is who's going to write it. Now, and obviously I can use the phrase a rookie mistake is to get them to write their own statement. But if they do, they're going to make mistakes we just mentioned there. Inadmissible evidence gets put in. They don't know what's admissible and what isn't. The idea is a statement is their personal account. So it refers to things which they've seen, which they heard, which they saw, which they said. To use the legal jargon, it's something they can speak to. They know because they were there. Opinions, rumors, secondhand information, you can't put those in because you can't test them for authenticity. You can't check they're accurate. You can't check they're viable. So you've got to know what goes in a statement. If you just tell them to write it up, they'll probably miss out half of it. And what they put in could well be stuff that can't really be used. So you write it, but you do it at their dictation. And that means you can keep them focused. If they drift off topic, you can gently bring them back. You can screen out the inadmissible stuff, and so you can save time. When I say you take it down at their dictation, you don't put in things like the ums and the ahs. It's not that precise. But you're writing down what they say on their behalf. But ultimately, it seems a bit of a chore to write it yourself, but it does actually save a lot of time. And it also gives the opportunity maybe to clarify what's being said, because they may mention as they're giving their statement something which they didn't mention in the interview, or they're giving you more detail. And so that's an opportunity to go back onto that straight away and expand on it and get that into the statement as well. So it's valuable from that point of view. Now, you've got a statement from a witness. They can't read or write in English. They can speak English quite happily, but for whatever reason, it's not their mother tongue. They can't read it, they can't write it. So is it okay if they just dictate the statement to you, you just sign it and file it? Is that acceptable? Well, the answer is no. You've got to read that statement back to them. They've got to agree that they are happy with what's in the statement, and then they sign it. What you would do in a case like that, you would read it back to them, they would sign it. You would then, in the interest of transparency, you would put an endorsement on the bottom of the statement confirming the person cannot read English. I wrote it back, I read it back to them. They are happy with what I said. On that basis, they have signed, and then you sign that little endorsement. And the point is, anybody else looking at the statement later on will know exactly how it was obtained. You're not hiding anything. Analyzing the evidence, again, it's the final stage, really. You've got the information, what you're going to do with it. And the evidence can come from a variety of sources. It can come from the interviews, it can come from documents, photographs, reports, a whole range of sources. And the idea is to put them all together. So we talk about this in the book in some detail, but very quickly, you get a statement off somebody, they've signed it, that is then sacrosanct. If you want to work on that, maybe to make notes on it or compare it with something else, work off a copy. Don't work off the original. Once it's signed, it's sealed. Keep it safe as a legal document. I've already mentioned about mind mapping. That's one way of analysing the evidence. You can sketch it out and see how the things fit together. You can also do a technique known as a timeline sketch. I think it's also called an Ishikawa diagram, because it's used in management in a lot of things. And it's basically a timeline. You go left to right in time, and you jot down the things that are known and the things which are suspected, and you put them in their appropriate time. You can link them together. And so as it develops, the sketch can be developed. You can see which things you know, which things you've got gaps about, where there appear to be differences. Somebody says they were in room A at 10 o'clock, but somebody else is saying quite clearly at 10 o'clock they saw that person in room B. So that's immediately flagged up an anomaly that's got to be checked out. It could be simply a simple mistake. It could be somebody's lying. So you get new lines of inquiry. If necessary, you can open up their own timelines. So that is basically a quick introduction to investigative interviewing. We'll be doing this live. I'll be asking questions, but can't do that. But what I can say, as Chris has already said, if you do have questions arising from this, then by all means contact me directly. I'll give my email in a moment, or email Natural HR and they'll get back to me and we'll sort it out somehow. So if you have questions, please do ask them.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. And
That's
as you
right.
just mentioned, if you would like to ask a question, the email address for Natural HR is marketing@naturalhr. And if you want to ask Andy a question directly, go to info@managementandsafety.co.uk, or you can connect with him on LinkedIn or drop him an email via LinkedIn as well. And I'm sure you'll get back to them, Andy. Okay, yeah. So just a final thing from me. If you did enjoy this webinar, we've also got another one later this month on the 22nd of July. This instalment will be with Jenny Barnes. She's basically going to discuss how to develop people analytic skills, which will better align with your company goals. So be sure to look out for the email for that. We'll post it on our social channels, on our website, so you'll be able to sign up through those channels. And that's it for today. And again, just want to say thank you, Andy, for running this webinar, and an apology again, just that we couldn't run this webinar live.
That was my pleasure, Chris. And again, my apologies for my computer playing tricks, but there we go. But thank you, everybody.
Okay, bye.